Vivian Ashcroft had watched 49 men change their expression the moment the server returned her card. Some checked their watches. Some suddenly remembered early meetings. Some simply stood without a word and left her with the bill. The 50th man was Noah Callahan, a single father who had exactly enough cash left to keep the lights on in his apartment. When the server placed the declined card back on the table, Vivian waited for Noah to do what the others had done. Instead, he quietly reached into his jacket, removed a worn envelope, and paid every dollar of the bill, including the tip. He said nothing dramatic. He only said that no one deserved to be humiliated over money. He had no idea the broke woman across from him owned the building they were sitting in, and that one small act of decency was about to detonate both their lives. Stay with this story, because what happens next is not what either of them expected. The Marlowe Street Bistro occupied a narrow corner on a street that smelled of rain and cold pavement, the kind of restaurant that kept its overhead lights dim and its menu short. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the woman who called herself Claire Dawson arrived 12 minutes early, took a seat near the window, and ordered tap water. She wore a gray wool coat with a fraying hem, no jewelry, and shoes that had been resoled at least once. Her hair was pulled back without effort. To everyone in that room, she looked like a woman who had recently fallen on hard times and was doing her best not to show it. Her name was not Claire Dawson. Her name was Vivian Ashcroft, and she was 37 years old, the chief executive officer of Ashcroft Meridian Holdings, an industrial and energy conglomerate with interests across 14 states, and a market valuation her finance team updated every 15 minutes. For the past 15 months, she had been running what she called a private assessment, though the people who loved her used a simpler word for it. Tessa Monroe, her chief of staff, and the only person who knew the full scope of the plan, called it a test. Vivian preferred assessment. Tests implied she was looking for a passing grade. She was looking for something harder to define. A man who would sit across from a woman with nothing and treat her like she was worth his time anyway. 49 men had failed that test in 15 months. They had been sourced through a discreet matchmaking firm that handled high-net-worth clients, the kind of service that verified backgrounds and income before a single message was exchanged. Each man arrived believing he had been matched with a financially comfortable professional. Each man sat down, ordered something from the menu, and within 20 minutes of hearing Claire explain that she was a temporary data entry worker living in a borrowed room with no savings to speak of, something behind their eyes shifted. It was a subtle shift, barely visible, but Vivian had become expert at reading it. The shift said, "This is not what I came here for." Some men ended the evening early with rehearsed excuses about early flights. Others simply let the bill arrive, glanced at it, and waited to see what Claire would do. And when she fumbled for her wallet, they offered their regrets and left. Only one man, the 31st, had stayed long enough to offer her a condescending lecture on budgeting before signaling for his coat. The 50th match was supposed to be a corporate attorney named Gregory Harmon, 44 years old, partner at a firm in the financial district. He canceled 40 minutes before the reservation via a text that contained 2 typos and no apology. The matchmaking firm scrambled and offered a replacement. Noah Callahan had been registered by a well-meaning friend who thought the widower needed to leave the apartment on a weeknight. Noah had not agreed to the profile. He had not agreed to anything. He showed up at Marlowe Street Bistro 11 minutes late because he had spent the previous hour and a half replacing a faulty igniter on a furnace for an elderly couple on the west side of town who could not afford to go without heat overnight. He was 40 years old, with the kind of hands that told the story of his work before he said a word, knuckles that had met steel and concrete more than once, a scar along the left thumb from a conduit edge that had caught him by surprise 6 years ago. His jacket was clean but old. His phone was already buzzing with a notification from his landlord's automated system. He looked across the table at Claire Dawson, apologized for being late, and, unlike all 49 men who had come before him, did not once look her up and down to estimate her value. He asked what kind of work made her happiest, and he listened to the answer. The server returned with the bill at 8:47. Vivienne had timed the evening carefully. She ordered modestly, kept the conversation unhurried, and waited for the moment that had ended 49 evenings before this one. When the check arrived, she placed her card on the tray with the same practiced motion she had used 49 times. A card that had been arranged through a private channel to decline on the first attempt, leaving just enough ambiguity to read as a genuine error rather than an obvious setup. The server returned, leaned close, and said the card had not gone through. Vivienne lowered her head and told him she could return tomorrow to settle the balance. She kept her voice steady. She had said that line so many times it no longer required effort. Then she waited. The bill was $86.40. Noah asked the server to read the total again. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and withdrew a plain white envelope. The envelope held $90 in cash, money set aside that morning at the kitchen table while Emery ate cereal across from him. Money that was intended to prevent the utility company from sending a technician to disconnect service to their apartment. He held it for a moment longer than a second, looking at the table rather than at the woman across from him. Then he counted out the bills, added a tip that brought the total to an even 100, and handed the envelope to the server without ceremony. He did not announce what he had done. He did not lean back in his chair to let the moment settle. When Vivienne asked for his account information so she could transfer the money back to him, he shook his head and told her that everyone had bad days and that she owed him no explanation in front of strangers. Before they left, he tore a corner from a paper napkin and wrote the name and address of a free employment resource center on the East Side, folded it once, and slid it across the table. He believed the woman sitting across from him genuinely needed help finding steadier work. He believed everything she had told him that evening, because he had no reason not to. Vivienne sat at the table alone after he walked out into the rain. She had never once felt ashamed during any of the 49 evenings before this one, because she had never once felt like herself during any of them. Tonight was different. She was the wealthiest person in that restaurant. She could have purchased the building, the block, and the restaurant group that owned the lease, and the transaction would not have required a phone call. And a man who was going home to a dark apartment had paid her dinner bill with money he could not afford to spend, not because he was trying to impress her, but because the alternative, watching a woman be embarrassed in public, was simply not acceptable to him. Tessa was waiting outside in a car. She offered to identify Noah's address and arrange an anonymous transfer to cover the amount before morning. Vivienne told her not to. She understood, without needing to analyze it, that depositing money into a stranger's account would reduce what he had done to a transaction, and that the one thing Noah Callahan had done tonight was refuse to let kindness become a transaction. What Vivienne did not know was that when Noah returned to the apartment that night, the lights did not come on. He told Emery it was a technical issue on the building's end, dug out an old flashlight from the kitchen cabinet, and spent the next 30 minutes rewiring a backup power strip to keep her phone and laptop charged until morning. He did not tell her about the bill or the envelope. He sat on the couch in the dark and thought about the woman named Claire and whether she would be all right. 2 days later, Vivienne sent a message from a number she had used only for the Claire identity. She thanked him for the evening and asked if he would accept a cup of coffee as partial repayment. Nothing expensive, just coffee. She expected a polite decline. Noah replied within the hour and suggested a place near the warehouses on the south end of town, a counter-service spot that charged $2.50 for a large cup and had exactly 4 stools at the window. He chose it because it was near the neighborhood where he worked most of his repair calls that week. She understood, without being told, that he had chosen it because he assumed Claire could not afford anything nicer. They sat side by side at the window counter and watched trucks move through an intersection while the coffee steamed between them. It was the most unguarded conversation Vivienne had experienced in years, possibly longer. No one in that coffee shop knew her net worth. No one was calculating how to leverage an introduction to her. Noah talked about what he liked about working with his hands. The clarity of a problem that either gets fixed or doesn't. The satisfaction of hearing a machine run quietly again after it had been failing. He asked what she missed most about work when she wasn't doing it, and when she answered, without thinking, that she missed the moment before a decision became irreversible. When all the variables were still visible, he nodded as though that made complete sense. She kept the name Claire. She told herself it was one more meeting to confirm what she already suspected, that Noah's behavior on the first evening had been genuine rather than calculated, but that reasoning had begun to lose its clarity. The more honest explanation was that she was afraid of the moment he learned he had been studied, afraid of watching something real collapse into betrayal before it had ever been given a name. Noah mentioned the Riverton facility during their third conversation. In the same unremarkable way, he mentioned other facts about his work history. He had spent 4 years as a safety systems supervisor at the Riverton plant, one of Ashcroft Meridian's manufacturing operations about 40 miles from the city. The plant had been shut down 14 months ago. 231 workers had been let go within a 3-week period. Noah had found his current work, freelance repairs and maintenance contracts, because he needed income and because no one in the industrial sector was hiring supervisors from a facility that had been classified as a liability. What he told her next was what changed the temperature of the conversation. 3 weeks before the closure announcement, he had discovered that the safety inspection reports submitted to the regulatory office had been altered. Data from his own maintenance logs he personally oversaw and signed, had been replaced with readings that indicated equipment failures too severe to correct. He brought the discrepancy to his manager, who forwarded the concern upward. 2 days later, Noah was placed on administrative review for what the HR documentation called a pattern of uncooperative conduct. He was dismissed 5 days before the closure was formally announced. Vivienne had signed the closure authorization. The memorandum that reached her desk described the Riverton facility as structurally compromised, operationally inefficient, and below compliance threshold. The signature on that memo was Damian Blackwood's. The document she had countersigned was a summary, not the primary inspection record. She had trusted the chain. She did not allow any of this to show on her face. She asked Noah about the maintenance logs in the way a person would ask out of passing curiosity. He told her he still had them. He kept a physical binder, numbered pages, original signatures from the city fire marshal, bound with a clip that had gone rust-colored at one corner. He had not kept it as evidence of wrongdoing or as leverage against anyone. He had kept it because the workers who lost their jobs deserved proof, even if only for themselves, that they had done nothing wrong. Tessa had been urging Vivienne to stop the Claire arrangement for 3 weeks by this point. Vivienne agreed, in the abstract, that it needed to end. She continued to delay, and she began to understand the nature of her own delay. She was no longer lying to test Noah. She was lying to keep him close, and those were two entirely different failures. On a gray afternoon at a harbor walkway where neither of them had arranged to meet and both had arrived separately for the same reason, to think. Noah walked beside her for a while before he asked, quietly, why she looked like a person waiting to be formally charged every time he mentioned the name Ashcroft Meridian. Vivienne gave Noah a partial truth. She said she had worked in a support role for a company that had contracted with Ashcroft Meridian, and that some of what he described aligned with things she had witnessed from the outside. It was not a lie in the technical sense. It was the kind of answer designed to provide just enough to hold the conversation open without releasing anything irreversible. Noah did not press. He took her to a community repair workshop that occupied the back half of a converted auto body shop on Farwell Street, where a group of retired mechanics and neighbors had organized Saturday sessions to help elderly residents repair household appliances that would otherwise be discarded. He handed Vivienne a small flathead screwdriver and a blown fuse from a space heater, and showed her, without condescension, how to check the rating stamp and match it to the replacement in the parts drawer. She found herself focusing with a concentration she rarely brought to tasks she did not consider consequential. She noticed something during those hours that she had not been able to observe in any boardroom or due diligence meeting. Noah Callahan was not performing decency for her. He moved through that workshop the same way he moved through every interaction she had witnessed, without calculation, without the subtle audit that most people ran on one another in social settings. He did not treat her more carefully because he found her interesting. He treated the 81-year-old man with the broken fan motor with the same patience and the same attention. That consistency was more persuasive than anything he could have said. Emery arrived briefly during the afternoon, carrying a bag of lunch she had made before class, setting it on the workbench near her father, without interrupting the conversation he was having with an older woman about a cracked heating element. She glanced once at Vivienne with the evaluating look of a daughter who has learned to read strangers quickly, then offered a short, friendly wave and left for her nursing program class. She had noticed her father was lighter lately. She left that observation where it was. Noah began noticing small inconsistencies in Claire that he could not place. She used financial terminology without self-consciousness, not the vocabulary of someone who had once worked adjacent to finance, but the native fluency of someone who had spent years inside it. She had the habit of scanning a room's exits before sitting down, the unconscious positioning of someone trained in security or private travel protocols. Once, when a car drove slowly past the workshop window, she identified the vehicle model and the specific trim package by name, and the price of that trim package was not a number a data entry worker would carry casually in memory. He did not confront her with these details. He decided, without certainty, that she had lived a more complicated life than what she was currently willing to describe, and that she had her reasons for the distance. He chose to respect the boundary rather than cross it without permission. He told himself that if she was hiding something serious, she would tell him when she was ready. He trusted that about her in a way that was not yet fully earned and which would later cost him. Tessa's quiet audit of the matchmaking firm's internal data returned results that were worse than either of them had anticipated. Buried inside the firm's selection algorithm was evidence of external modification, specifically a filtering parameter that had been quietly added to Vivienne's account 18 months earlier. That parameter excluded any candidate whose financial and behavioral profile suggested contentment with modest circumstances. Instead, it weighted toward men with specific patterns, unresolved debt, documented aspirational spending, and prior search activity indicating interest in wealthy partners. These men were not hired performers. They were real people selected for their existing vulnerabilities. Before each match, a suggestion had been sent through the firm's internal messaging system, framed as a profile insight, that the woman they were meeting might come from family money, that she was conducting a private assessment, and that presenting well could lead somewhere significant. When Claire arrived looking like a woman without resources, those men experienced what felt like a bait and switch, and they responded accordingly. Damian Blackwood had not manufactured their behavior. He had simply ensured Vivienne would only meet men whose worst qualities were positioned to emerge. 49 consecutive failures had not been coincidence. They had been engineered to leave Vivienne convinced that no man could be trusted, dependent on the counsel of the one person who had been systematically discrediting every alternative. Noah was not supposed to be in that sequence at all. The attorney who had canceled that evening had been the intended 50th candidate, a man whose file contained 2 prior lawsuits involving misrepresented assets in personal relationships. Noah had been added to the pool by a junior coordinator who processed the emergency substitution without access to the filter modifications. He arrived at Marlowe Street Bistro without a suggestion in his inbox, without an agenda, and without any reason to perform. The same investigation uncovered the shape of the Riverton transaction. After closure, the land and the intellectual property attached to the facility's safety control systems had been sold to a company registered in Delaware that had no operational history beyond the purchase date. That company held patents on thermal regulation systems that Ashcroft Meridian's engineering division was independently developing. The plan, visible in email drafts that had not been fully deleted from a shared server, was to sell those patents back to Ashcroft Meridian at a price many times the acquisition cost, with the transaction routed through layers of subsidiaries that would obscure the original seller's identity. Damian's goal was not only financial. He was building a dossier, a portrait of Vivienne Ashcroft, as an executive who made decisions based on sentiment, who had allowed personal paranoia to drive a months-long deception, and whose judgment was too unstable for continued leadership. The 50-date story, released at the right moment with the right framing, would be the final entry in that dossier. Tessa reached Vivienne on a Thursday morning and said, simply, that they needed to have the meeting with Noah before the weekend. Vivienne agreed. She sent Noah a message asking to meet Friday evening at Marlowe Street Bistro. He confirmed within minutes. That afternoon, Noah received a call from a facilities management company he had never heard of. They offered him a position at a salary more than 3 times his current income, with one condition attached at the end of the conversation, offered as though it were an afterthought. They would need him to transfer his personal copy of any documentation related to the Riverton safety assessment as part of the onboarding verification process. Noah ended the call. He sat in his truck for several minutes looking at the steering wheel. Then he called the number he had saved as Claire. She answered on the second ring. He asked whether she had told anyone about the Riverton maintenance binder. The pause before her answer lasted 4 seconds longer than it should have. They were still seated across from each other at the familiar corner table. At Marlowe Street Bistro on a Friday evening in late March, when the first camera flash went off outside the window, Noah's phone lit up simultaneously with 3 different notifications. He picked it up out of reflex, and the headline he read first was framed as a feature story, the kind of piece written to appear amused while delivering maximum damage. It described a billionaire CEO who had conducted a 50-date deception across 15 months, posing as a financially desperate woman to identify which men were capable of genuine generosity, and it named the single father who had passed the test by spending his last $90 on her dinner. The article included photographs of Vivian in 4 of the earlier dates. It included a copy of the credit card terminal receipt from Marlowe Street Bistro showing the declined transaction. It included a photograph of Noah, taken from a public source, with a caption describing his employment history and current income. The framing made him sound like a contestant in a game he had not agreed to play and had accidentally won. Noah set the phone face down on the table. He looked at the woman sitting across from him for a long moment. Then he looked again at the photograph of Vivian Ashcroft that appeared in the publication. Her official portrait from the Ashcroft Meridian Investor Relations page, the version used in quarterly reports and conference materials, and he compared it without expression to the woman in the gray coat who had told him her name was Claire. Vivienne said his name, not Claire, not the name she had been using. She said her own name first, reflexively, like a person stepping out of costume in front of someone who had trusted the costume. She confirmed everything. She was the CEO. The card had been arranged to decline. The job she had described did not exist in the form she had presented it. She told him that what she felt after the first evening was real, that the weeks that had followed were real, that she had wanted to tell him the truth for months and had found increasingly inadequate reasons not to. Noah listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He told her that the $86.40 was not what hurt. He told her that he understood why someone in her position would want to know whether they were being valued for themselves. He told her none of that was the wound. The wound was that she had known, within the first 2 or 3 evenings they spent together, that the money she had cost him mattered to his actual life. Had known, because she was paying close attention to everything, that he had gone home to a dark apartment. And she had continued to hold the decision about when he deserved to know the truth. She had made herself the final authority on when he was allowed to understand the situation he was in. He said, "You did not give me the option of choosing whether I wanted to walk into your world. You changed the terms every time I came close to the edge of the real one." Vivian placed an envelope on the table, the reimbursement Tessa had prepared weeks earlier, held in reserve. Noah pushed it back without opening it. He told her that what he had done at this table 4 months ago was not a loan. It was not a test he had passed that entitled him to a reward. It was not currency she could deposit and subtract from her account of obligations. He stood, put on his jacket, and walked out through the front door into the crowd of photographers who had already assembled on the sidewalk. Vivian did not follow him into the street. She understood that every move she made in the next 60 seconds would be captured and interpreted, and that any gesture in his direction would extend his exposure in a story that had already made him a character without his consent. Inside the building, across the city, Damian Blackwood was on a call with 3 board members, telling them the evening had unfolded exactly as anticipated, and that an emergency session should be convened before the weekend was over. By the following Monday, the phrase billionaire beggar test had appeared in more than 400 publications in 17 countries. It became the kind of story that generated two parallel and contradictory moral panics simultaneously. One condemning Vivian for treating working-class men as experimental subjects, and one accusing Noah of being a calculated actor who had performed decency to position himself for a relationship with one of the wealthiest women in the country. Both versions required their proponents to ignore large portions of what had actually happened, but factual completeness had never been a requirement of outrage. Noah's freelance repair clients began canceling within 48 hours. Several of them sent apologetic texts explaining that they didn't want to be photographed at their own homes. One client who had known him for 3 years sent nothing. The appointment simply did not appear in his calendar when the day arrived. The practical consequences were immediate. Emery was approached by a reporter outside her nursing program building on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Noah had made arrangements for her to stay temporarily with his sister-in-law in a neighborhood 20 minutes outside the city, away from the address that had been published in 2 separate outlets. The Ashcroft Meridian Board presented Vivian with a strategy document the following Wednesday. The document recommended a joint statement to be released by both parties, characterizing the 50-date arrangement as a consensual social experiment that Noah had been aware of from the beginning, a mutually agreed narrative that would reframe the story as charming eccentricity rather than deception, protect the company's stock position, and neutralize the basis for any board challenge to her leadership. It required Noah's cooperation and a signed non-disclosure arrangement. It would require Noah to surrender the only version of events in which he had been treated honestly. Damien presented the strategy as the only viable option and waited for Vivian to approve it. He had presented her with similar choices before, always structured so that the pragmatic path and the path that benefited him most were the same path, and she had taken them because the framing was always persuasive and the alternative always appeared to carry a higher immediate cost. She declined without deliberating. At a press conference held the following Thursday, in the Ashcroft Meridian Communications suite, Vivian read a statement she had written herself. Without a communications consultant in the room, she confirmed the full scope of the arrangement. She did not characterize it as a social experiment. She did not describe Noah as a winner of anything. She stated clearly that he had not known her identity, had not been briefed or compensated, and had no role in designing or executing any part of the arrangement. She requested explicitly that media organizations cease publishing his home address or his daughter's school affiliation. She acknowledged that the decision to continue the deception after genuine feelings had developed was a failure of courage, not a consequence of strategic necessity. She also announced that Ashcroft Meridian was conducting an active investigation into the circumstances surrounding this Riverton plant closure, that she was voluntarily stepping back from financial approval authority pending the completion of an independent audit, and that she was directing the legal team to preserve all internal communications related to the facility's sale. The stock dropped 4% by close of trading. 3 board members called her personally to express concern. Damien submitted a formal request for an emergency governance review before the week ended. It was the first time in her professional life that Vivian Ashcroft had told the complete truth at a moment when the truth offered her nothing in return. Damien sent a lawyer to Noah's apartment 3 days after the press conference. The offer was $2 million, structured as a settlement for emotional damages arising from the exposure of his personal information during the media coverage. The condition attached to the offer was a signed affidavit stating that Vivienne had used his financial vulnerability as a public relations device, that she had known about his electricity situation and chosen to withhold reimbursement for editorial purposes, and that his participation in subsequent events had been conducted under duress. Noah asked the lawyer to leave his doorstep. Before the man turned to go, a document slid partially out of the briefcase, an internal Ashcroft Meridian safety report bearing the Riverton facility number at the top of the page. Noah caught sight of it for less than 3 seconds. The page numbers in the header matched the pagination system in his maintenance binder exactly. The dates in the body of the document did not match anything he had recorded. Someone had taken the formatting and structure of his original logs and substituted new conclusions. Noah closed the door. He retrieved the binder from the back shelf of his closet, sat at the kitchen table, and went through it page by page against what he had just seen. The numbering was identical. The timestamps had been altered. The inspection results had been inverted. The document Damien's lawyer was carrying had been built to look authoritative using the architecture of a record Noah had originated. But the content had been entirely replaced. He understood then that whoever had constructed the false report had also understood, at some point, that the original existed and would eventually surface. He made a phone call, not to Vivienne, to the retired city fire marshal whose signature appeared on the last 3 pages of the binder. The board session was convened on a Wednesday in the main conference room at the Ashcroft Meridian headquarters, a room with a long table, floor-to-soiling glass on the east side, and the kind of institutional weight that was designed to make dissent feel disproportionate. Damien presented his case in 45 minutes, using slides prepared by a consulting firm whose engagement had not been disclosed to the board prior to that morning. He characterized Vivienne's press conference as a unilateral act of governance sabotage, described the 50-date arrangement as evidence of psychological instability at the executive level, and presented the ongoing media fallout as a direct consequence of her inability to separate personal conduct from fiduciary responsibility. He then moved formally to initiate a vote on interim leadership transfer. Vivienne did not dispute the facts of her conduct. She asked the board to consider 2 separate questions before the vote: whether the Riverton closure had been authorized through legitimate channels, and whether the firm that had managed her personal matchmaking arrangement had any financial relationship with current Ashcroft Meridian leadership. She provided printed copies of the preliminary audit findings. The documents showed an authorization signature attributed to her, timestamped at a period during which her calendar confirmed she had been out of the country at a regulatory summit with no remote access to the approval system. Damien told the board that the authentication question was a distraction and asked them to proceed to the vote. The door at the back of the conference room opened. Noah Callahan entered alongside Margaret Fowler, the retired city fire marshal who had signed the last inspection cycle at the Riverton facility, and a representative from an independent forensic accounting firm that had been retained the previous week. Noah placed the physical maintenance binder on the table near the center without ceremony. Margaret Fowler set a sworn affidavit beside it confirming the date range of her inspections and the results as she had personally recorded them, results that showed the facility operating within compliance parameters 72 hours after the date on which Damien's report claimed a catastrophic systems failure had been discovered. The forensic representative presented a 2-page summary of financial flows from the Delaware company that had purchased the Riverton land and intellectual property, tracing the beneficial ownership through 4 shell layers to a family trust administered by a firm that managed assets on behalf of the Blackwood family estate. Tessa spoke last. She had compiled the full record of Damien's communications with the matchmaking firm, including the introduction of the filtering parameter, the pre-meeting suggestion messages, and the authorization signature on the account modification. A signature that matched the one appearing on the Riverton closure authorization. Damien said nothing when the summary was complete. He adjusted his cufflinks and looked at the table. The board chair asked him to step out of the room while the members conferred. He did not return. By the end of the day, the matter had been referred to the State Attorney General's office and the federal regulatory body with jurisdiction over the facility sale. There was no dramatic arrest, no raised voices. The room was quiet for a long time after Noah and the others finished presenting, the way rooms go quiet when something has been settled that was disguised as something complicated. The board moved to restore Vivienne's executive authority at a special session the following week. She accepted on 3 conditions: the formation of an independent oversight committee with authority to review any financial transaction above a defined threshold, the establishment of a restitution fund for Riverton workers, capitalized from the proceeds of the recovered land transaction, administered by a non-profit organization with no affiliation to Ashcroft Meridian, and a formal limitation on any individual board member's authority to act without full committee disclosure. These were not conditions designed to make her look magnanimous. They were structural corrections to the gaps Damien had exploited. After the main session ended and most people had moved to the hallway, Vivienne found Noah near the windows at the far end of the room. She thanked him. He told her he had come for the workers at Riverton, and that she should understand those were not the same thing. She said she did understand. She asked him not to pretend otherwise. He said he wouldn't. Before he reached the door, he turned back once and told her that she had cost him a significant amount of trust in a single night, and that trust was not rebuilt with speeches. She said she knew that. She said she intended to rebuild it the only way it could actually be rebuilt, with time and nothing else. He left without responding. She did not interpret the silence as cruelty. She understood it as the only honest answer to an honest statement. 6 months passed with the particular quality of months that are uneventful by design rather than accident. The Riverton facility reopened under a new operational charter as a regional industrial safety research center, a conversion that required extensive renovation and the creation of 43 full-time positions, the majority of which were offered first to workers from the original facility. The restitution fund, once the recovered proceeds cleared escrow, issued payments to 217 former employees within 90 days of the board's authorization. The legal proceedings against Damien Blackwood moved through the early stages of a process that would take considerably longer than any of the immediate participants preferred, but moved steadily. Vivienne retained her position after a second confirmation vote, one in which she received fewer unconditional votes than she had carried in previous cycles, which she recorded privately as a fair outcome given the circumstances. The Oversight Committee began its work. She found, to her measured surprise, that sharing authority over certain decisions made those decisions better rather than slower. She did not announce this realization to anyone. She incorporated it. Noah was approached in September by the search committee overseeing the safety director role at the revitalized Riverton Center. The committee had been constituted entirely of external appointees, former regulatory officials, a labor attorney, and an engineer from a neighboring facility, with no Ashcroft Meridian executives in the room. He verified this independently before accepting a meeting. He asked direct questions about the reporting structure and the limits of executive override authority. He accepted the position in October after reviewing a contract that had been drafted by a firm he selected himself. The salary was substantial relative to his previous income. It was not a transformation. It was stability, which was the specific thing he had been working toward for 14 months without attaining it. During those 6 months, Vivienne sent Noah no personal messages. She made no gestures that could be characterized as wooing. She did not arrange favorable coverage of his appointment or allow her name to be associated with the hiring process in any public communication. When a business publication ran a piece on the Riverton Center's opening and mentioned Noah in passing, she offered no response when her communications team asked whether she wanted to weigh in. She had no productive role in his life during those 6 months, and she did not manufacture one. In November, Noah sent her a message asking if she was available on a Thursday evening. The message did not include a reason or an explanation. She replied that she was. He suggested Marlowe Street Bistro. She arrived before him, as she had the first time. She wore clothes she had chosen herself, without assistance. No jewelry designed to communicate net worth. No aide waiting outside in a vehicle. The coat was not the fraying gray one. That had been a costume. But it was not particularly expensive either. She sat at the same table near the window and ordered tap water and found herself uncertain, for the first time in longer than she could precisely recall, of what came next. Noah arrived 3 minutes early. He sat across from her, and for the first time in every conversation they had ever shared, both of them knew exactly who the other person was. She told him things she had not told anyone. The specific shape of the fear that had started the 50-date plan. Not a vague fear of being used, but the precise memory of reading a message on a private server sent by her former fiancé to a business contact, in which her emotional responses to certain topics were cataloged as pressure points to be applied during negotiations. The clinical quality of that message, the way it processed her grief over her mother's illness into leverage, had removed something from her ability to trust that she had not fully recovered. She had designed a test because a test promised her control, and control was the substitute she had accepted in place of the thing that had been taken. Noah did not immediately reassure her. He sat with what she had described for a moment before he said anything. Then he said that he understood why someone would build a wall after being used like that, and that he was not interested in pretending the wall had not existed. He said the only way forward from where they were was a genuine agreement that neither of them would test the other, not with silence, not with information withheld to see how the other responded, not with any of the smaller experiments that people use to determine whether someone is worthy of continued trust. The bill arrived. Vivienne picked it up before it had fully settled on the table. She placed a card on the tray. The server returned, confirmed the transaction, and set the receipt down. She signed it. The total was $86.40. The same as the first evening, an alignment neither of them mentioned until Noah smiled at the number and asked whether she had called ahead to arrange it. She said she hadn't. He looked at her for a moment and decided he believed her. She put a tip on the receipt that brought the total to an even 100. Noah set his own money on the table beside hers, enough to cover half the tip without saying anything about it. She understood what the gesture meant, that this was not a dinner she was hosting, and that going forward, the accounting between them would not belong to either one of them alone. Before they stood to leave, she asked whether this counted as a first date. He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. He said it did not. He said it was the first time they had met while both of them were actually present. The first evening in which neither of them was performing a version of themselves that had been designed for the other's benefit. She found that answer more satisfying than any of the 49 evenings she had designed from the beginning to tell her something true. They walked out into a light rain, side by side, neither of them moving ahead of the other. The city was quiet in the way it gets on Thursday evenings in late fall when the working week is nearly over, and the cold has persuaded most people to stay inside. There was no resolution declared. There was no formal beginning announced. There was only two people walking through rain on a street they had both traveled before, and this time, for the first time, they were going in the same direction, and both of them knew where they were.